And one of the principal abiotic factors that determines the distribution of life on Earth is the sources of energy that are required for life. So if you remember, all organisms require some source of energy, here, like capital E for energy, in order to live, in order to survive. So solar energy, captured by photosynthesis, powers most ecosystems in the sense that solar energy through photosynthesis is captured by your autotrophs, right? Your photosynthetic organisms. They produce carbohydrates and other biological molecules. They feed themselves, they grow, and then along come consumers, herbivores, that consume that plant matter, transferring energy in the form of chemical energy to them. They do cellular respiration, providing energy for them. Remember ATP? And then, lo and behold, there's another type of consumer, predator, that will eat the herbivores, and so forth, depending on how elaborate the feeding chain is. Everything will die. Decomposition releases energy back into the environment, but most importantly, nutrients and such back into the soil, so that photosynthesizers have ready access to those organic and even inorganic molecules to grow. So energy flows through a system, and most ecosystems on planet Earth are powered by sunlight energy. So on land, the terrestrial environment, sunlight energy is abundant for most photosynthetic organisms to drive those terrestrial ecosystems. But in dense forests, shading can be a problem and causes competition on the forest floor for plants, things that need sunlight. In some of the tropical rainforests, the tree cover, the canopy is so dense that no direct sunlight actually reaches the forest floor, and it can actually be fairly dark. So even though there's a lot of sunlight hitting the surface of the planet, sometimes sunlight can be limiting. Excuse me. In aquatic environments, lakes, rivers, especially big rivers and the ocean, photosynthesis occurs near the surface because sunlight energy can only penetrate so far into water before it loses enough energy that photosynthesis is not really possible at depth. So light, however, does thrive in environments that are completely dark. Remember those deep oceanic hydrothermal vents that are powered by chemoautotrophic bacteria that harness energy from molecules spewed out by these hydrothermal vents, like hydrogen sulfide, this H2S. And then those chemoautotrophic bacteria, some of them are symbiotic. I don't know if they're sympathetic, but they're symbiotic within some of these tube worms that helps them harness energy from their environment. And then there's other organisms that live in this unique environment. And we talked about this unique environment when we were talking about the evolution of life on Earth. Okay. So temperature is another important abiotic component to determine the distribution of life on Earth. So few organisms can really maintain efficient metabolism, meaning the cellular processes that allow them to live at temperatures close to 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit or colder, or at temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter. Remember, there are some extreme organisms, those extremophiles like archaea, and some bacteria that can live at some of these extreme environmental temperature habitats. But most organisms we're familiar with, and in a way the larger, more complex ones, do best at temperatures within specific ranges. So again, temperature is an important abiotic factor. Water is another one. It's essential for life. All right? If you remember, life evolved in water. So aquatic organisms, like these fish here, for example, surrounded by water, and they face problems of water balance, either gaining too much water in a freshwater environment or losing too much water in a saltwater environment. So water balance becomes essential, critical for aquatic organisms, whether they live in freshwater habitats or in the ocean. And they have mechanisms to help them survive such things. Remember when we looked at water balance at the cellular level? Under ISO, similar, isotonic solutions, external solutions relative to cells. The cells are happy. The amount of water that's absorbed equals the amount of water that's lost. But in hypotonic environments, excess water outside, like fresh water, water enters into cells and tissues and organisms through osmosis. And if there's no mechanism for dealing with that, that can cause major problems. The opposite is also true in hypertonic solutions, hyper meaning excess, solutes externally, like in salt water. The problem is that there's an excess net loss of water. And organisms need to have mechanisms to deal with that, or, again, serious problems can occur, even death. So water is essential for life, and the type of water and the amount of water and quality of water helps determine what organisms can live in particular habitats. So for terrestrial organisms, the danger is loss of water. Desiccation means drying out. So they have ways to deal with that. They've evolved things like watertight coverings, like scales on reptiles. Humans, we have fairly dry skin that prevents excess water loss or desiccation. Most plants produce a waxy coat called a cuticle that prevents excess moisture loss through evaporation or desiccation. So that transition of and the colonization of land by our aquatic ancestors had to go hand in hand with the development, the advancement, the appearance of water retaining surface coverings or mechanisms. Excuse me. And again, most plants have a waxy coating, a cuticle, on their leaves to prevent desiccation. So inorganic nutrients are important. We're not going to get into nutrient cycling, but just know that in the environment, there's inorganic nutrients that must be somehow absorbed into organisms to allow those organisms to utilize those inorganic nutrients to make essentially biological molecules. So the distribution and abundance of photosynthetic organisms, because they're the base of the food chain in most places, depends on the availability of these inorganic nutrients, in particular nitrogen N and phosphorus P. So this is showing that phosphate, a form of phosphorus in the soil, is made available basically through weathering. And then once it's in the soil, plants can uptake it, making things like DNA, right? Nucleic acids, which have phosphates, phosphorus, and proteins and other molecules. Where's my cursor? Here we go. So once the plants absorb phosphate, an inorganic nutrient, into their tissues in biological molecules, that can be transferred to animals that eat that eat plants. And then there's other animals, that will eat those animals, and so forth through a food chain. And then decomposers, once those animals die, release nutrients back into the environment. So these chemicals, inorganic nutrients, cycle through the environment. As we see here, right? Minerals get released into the soil through decomposition, get absorbed into plants. Plants grow, herbivores eat plants, carnivores, predators eat herbivores, and the availability of these inorganic nutrients really determines the abundance and health and amount of plant growth on the planet. So soil structure is important, how sandy it is, how much organic material it is, how rocky it is. pH of the soil is important, right? Too acidic, too basic is not good. And then, of course, these nutrient availability play a major role in determining the distribution of plants. And then that means the distribution of animals, because most of them depend on plants either directly or indirectly. So now let's move on to aquatic factors. In aquatic ecosystems, growth of algae and photosynthetic bacteria, right? The base of the food chain, the producers in aquatic systems, is often determined and limited, by these nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that usually wind up in water, aquatic ecosystems, by being washed in from the land. So these nutrients are important for photosynthetic organismal growth. And then there are fish and other animals that will eat those things, and then those nutrients go into those animals, and then you have the aquatic food chain. So in aquatic ecosystems, just like on land, they're limited by certain things. Availability of oxygen in the water. Fish, for example, have to obtain dissolved oxygen from the water so that they can do aerobic respiration, just like us. Right? They absorb the oxygen through their gills. The salinity, how much salt is in the water, is important because that determines what organisms can live there, or certain organisms have evolved for handling particular salinity of water. Currents are important, right? Depending on how fast and rapidly the water is moving, depends on what organisms can handle that. And then at the coast, the tides coming up and down is important and determines which organisms can live at the boundary between land and water. So the aquatic factors are important for the distribution of organisms on life. Distributions of organisms on Earth. So terrestrial factors on land, ecosystems, meaning the organisms that are living, different species, communities that are living in particular habitats. Their numbers and abundances of them, or abundance of them, is determined by things like wind. Wind is important. For example, wind can cause excess desiccation, drop temperatures, etc. Storms, the numbers of storms, how frequent storms are, and even fire is important. We happen to live in a place here in California where fire is a naturally occurring factor that determines distribution of plant life. So think back before humans, populated California. We live in what's referred to as a chaparral biome, chaparral environment, where many of the plants are actually adapted to fire. So adjusting to environmental variability is important for organisms. The environment isn't always constant. So when it changes, organisms need to be able to adjust to those changes one way or another, or they're not going to survive. So the abiotic factors in a habitat can vary from year to year, seasonally. Think of a hot summer, cold, freezing winter, or over a course of a day, especially like in the intertidal zone. Think of tide pools. During part of the day, they're submerged in water. During part of the day, they're exposed to sun and wind and dryness. So that's a really big variability on a daily cycle. So numerous examples. Birds can adjust to cold by migrating in the winter. That's a behavioral response. There's many, many migratory birds. Some do not migrate, but many do. Other animals as well. Growing heavier feathers, an anatomical response, or fur. So what I was saying there is growing heavier feathers, for example, in animals is an anatomical response. Birds, for example. Some animals will gain weight during the winter. Like imagine a bear that fattens up in the winter to gain weight and then goes into, say, hibernation, which is a physiological response. Some animals will fluff up their feathers to trap heat. Think of a cat on a cold day. Right? That's a physiological response. So these last two, the heavier feathers, or insulating fat, or fluffing up your feathers or your fur, these are responses for animals that tend not to migrate so they can deal with cold temperatures. Here we go. So continuing with this physiological responses, acclimation is something that animals will do, and tends to be a gradual but a reversible adjustment, physiological adjustment to a change in the environment. So normally animals that adjust to an environment, say cold environment, animals that don't migrate, can revert back to their normal physiological conditions during a warm environment.